Hello, we're going to go over the notes for the Great Depression. My suggestion is come into my class, grab the fill-in-the-blank notes, get the stuff down that you need to that perhaps you missed before. You can also use this video to help you kind of retouch mentally some of the things that I've covered in class. It's really important that everyone come to class every day. You're going to miss some of the content. Even though I will go over the notes, there are some things we talked about that will not be in the presentation today. When we talk about the Great Depression, we're talking about what is quite arguably the biggest economic collapse in world history. From 1929 until early 1942, the U.S. and most of the world was dealing with the longest economic collapse in our modern industrial world. Well, what do I mean by a depression? We're talking a very long period of time, at least 6 months, more than likely years, where you've got high unemployment, business collapses, a shrinking economy. So a recession might last 6 months, maybe a year. The Depression lasted a decade. It is a very long-term period where, for example, it had the U.S. industrial output shrink by 50%. You saw unemployment rise from 5% unemployment all the way to 25%. So 1 out of 4 Americans, I heard a stat recently that if you laid each unemployed person head to foot, on in a line, it would connect from New York City to Seattle to Los Angeles back to New York City, and you'd still have 250,000 people left over. That is how excessive the unemployment was during the Great Depression. It's caused by 4 big areas. The first one, of course, is the stock market boom and bust. The old idea was for, during the stock period, for people to buy stock on margin. In other words, that they would take a loan out from a brokerage firm or a bank. They would only pay a portion of the actual stock. $100,000 worth of stock, they may only pay $5,000 or $10,000, borrow the rest of the money. The idea is down the road, when they sold the stock, they'd pay off the loan, everyone makes money. And in the 1920s, that largely worked. Until the late 20s, when people really began to suspect that the U.S. was overvaluing its stocks. They began to lose confidence in 1929 particularly, and you saw by October a massive sell-off. On October 29th, 1929, also known as Black Tuesday, the largest single-day sell-off of stocks caused a lot of the loans to be called in. The problem is, when the stock market hit that all-time low, businesses went bankrupt, and people didn't have money to pay off their loans. So that's one of the first things that's going to kick off. And as you can see in this newspaper article that day, October 24th, the week before, Wall Street was in a panic, but you still have articles about assassinations and investigations about crooked politicians, a missing plane. No one really suspected how bad it would be. But let's look at a long-term view. In 1920, you saw the stock market fairly low, but the value of the stocks grew over that decade until October 29th, 1929, when, as I said earlier, huge drop in the market. Within a 1-year period, that market drop was substantial. It dropped almost half its value in about a year. And by 1932, mid-32, you saw the stock market back to almost nothing. Well, I talked about the stock market collapsing, but that's not the only issue. Think about our last unit when we talked about this consumerism, the idea of borrowing money to pay for things, toasters, dryers, cars, houses. People borrowed heavily, and banks were making a ton of money. It was really easy money. Banks again loaned out money for people to buy stocks. When the stock market collapsed, you begin to see people rushing to the banks in order to withdraw their money. So not only are the banks not going to make their money back from the stock market collapse, but now banks are starting to see people literally pulling their entire life savings out of banks out of fear that they would lose their money. Well, unfortunately, when banks see all the money pulled out, they close. Banks simply did not have enough money with the withdrawals, and many of the banks closed. The bottom left screen shows you that by 1933, you have huge numbers of banks simply failing. So the Great Depression started with the stock market. Now we see the credit collapse. Well, that's going to impact another area, which is economic instability. So when the credit economy, this credit collapse occurred, consumers are no longer buying cars. They're no longer buying toasters, houses. And that means the companies that produce these products have to start laying off workers. Well, that becomes a cycle. Those unemployed people can no longer continue buying what they like to buy: clothing, machines, cars, houses. And so you begin to see more businesses closing and more layoffs occur. It becomes a vicious cycle. And that economic instability would see unemployment go from 5% to 25% in less than 4 years. But it's not just in the cities that we see this instability. Farmers are unable to make a profit because they were overgrowing crops. There's a number of reasons why. Trying to feed Europe during World War I, and that just kind of continued. Of course, farmers also took loans out to pay for farm extensions, to pay for equipment. They no longer have the money to pay off those loans. Banks begin to come take their loans. Another issue is really environmental. And we talked a little bit about it in class in depth. But the idea of the Great Plains particularly, it was over-farmed. The topsoil is destroyed and crops begin to fail. The picture on the bottom left of the screen shows you a car that was buried by this dust. And so when we say the Dust Bowl, I mean entire farms were unable to produce any crops, which means they went broke. Farmers began to move into cities looking for work. Well, that's going to make things worse. Now you've got even more unemployed people looking for jobs, fighting over the jobs. The pay that people were making at these jobs could be dropped because it was competition. Who will work for the cheapest? And so the economic collapse there, very real. This is a picture of the Dust Bowl that occurred during the 1920s. And the Dust Bowl covered a decent amount of that Midwest. You can see on the map there, particularly the areas affected. A lot of those people will simply abandon their farms and move off into cities for work. The fourth major cause is the government itself. It didn't do enough. Government policy, as we had talked about in the last couple of units, you don't interfere with business. You let business handle itself. The U.S. government particularly refused to regulate businesses, so you had an unstable economy. They wouldn't step in when businesses began to collapse. We'll talk about the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in just a moment. When it comes to credit, lenders during the 1920s were never controlled. So those lending institutions, the banks and the firms that would loan out money, were never controlled by American leaders and prevented from loaning unresponsibly. And as a result, the credit industry collapses. People begin to question if the American system, the American democracy, had failed. And this is a time when Hitler in Germany is on the rise. In Japan, you're going to see the rise of fascism there. Italy had been on that track for a while. And even in America, we begin looking at like Father Tom Coughlin, Huey Long, people who promised a lot, but they were going to take away our freedoms. This is an article from 1932, former soldiers who were getting together. Now, we talked about this in class, but take a minute, pause it, go through it. What shows you the desperation? Think about race. Okay? And is this more revolutionary or reform? We talked about this in class. Kind of come in, talk to me later if you're not clear as to the answers. The Hoover presidency was not doing well. As I just previously said, the government had not done enough. Hoover had only taken small steps, small government actions in order to try to stop the Great Depression. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was created to try to pump government money into private institutions, into corporations, into banks, into nonprofit organizations like the American Red Cross. But it wasn't enough money. They simply didn't provide enough. By the late 20s, early 30s, a lot of former World War I veterans who had been expecting a bonus 20 years after their service marched on Washington, D.C. with their families saying, "We demand our bonus now, we need our money now." The government took that as a threat. They ordered the former soldiers and their families to clear out of the Capitol, and when that didn't happen, the U.S. Army was sent in order to move the protesters. Things turned violent very quickly. 2 people were killed, and the other thing that was killed, Hoover's chances of re-election. This is an electoral map in 1928. All the red states voted for Herbert Hoover. He had 58% of the vote. He had 83% of the electoral vote. 4 years later, the Great Depression had changed things quite a bit. The red states are the ones that voted for Hoover. The blue states voted for a change. You're talking a flip-flop. 56% or 58% had voted for Hoover in 1928. Almost 58% had voted for someone else 4 years later. And that person would be Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which we're going to spend a lot more time on in this unit. If you have questions, please come see me. I'd love to answer them, but make sure you're getting your study guide filled out. We want to make sure that you're keeping on top of things. All right, thank you.